How would you describe the state of Oregon streets right now?
It's a mess. I mean, let me give you a very personal example that happened this morning. I was driving to this office, and out in front of a building in downtown Portland, there were 2 police cars and multiple officers, and they were rolling over a guy who was either unconscious from drugs or in extremis, could be dead. That shouldn't be happening in a major metropolitan city with the regularity that it's happening with. We've had now, assuming that this guy is, this was a mortal situation, that's 3 dead bodies within 2 blocks of this building in the last 3 months. One of them was a suicide, but something drove that person to jump off of a building. So it's a mess. You can't go anywhere in Portland and not see the effects of urban decay here, and it's tragic. This is a beautiful city. I grew up in Central Oregon. We used to come over here all the time during the holidays because this was like a magical place. It is not a magical place anymore.
In one of your recent campaign ads, it shows you driving down the street, passing tents on the sidewalk, and I think you say something along the lines of no more tent cities. How do you plan to do that?
Well, there are a variety of different methodologies. First of all, let me say that I think Portland has enabled tent cities, and I sure as hell know that Tina Kotek has enabled tent cities with the legislation that she has championed and pushed through the system. So we need to get the tents off the streets. There are a variety of different methodologies that are being tested right now. A Portland lawyer has a case based on the Americans with Disability Act because it is forcing disabled people out into the streets. Older people are having a hard time navigating. People with sight disabilities having a hard time navigating. So it'll be interesting to see how that case makes its way. The next thing is that the Boise case has complicated the situation slightly, but if there is alternative space, we need to get the tents off the streets and to that alternative space. And we can come back and talk about that in a minute. And then there are laws about camping in public places. Enforce the law. And that's a City of Portland problem and a City of Portland prerogative, and I think they ought to be much more aggressive about it. People that moved near a beautiful park do not want to be fearful of taking their children there for fear that they're going to be assaulted, step on a needle, be harassed. So enforce the law is a piece of this.
So this is often seen as a municipal issue. What do you plan to do at the state level, and what have you already done at the state level?
Well, I reject your premise. Let me be clear. When you say a municipal issue, are you referring to Portland?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes it's seen as it's the city's responsibility to deal with what's on their streets.
Okay, but let's be clear, because I've represented a lot of cities. It is no longer a Portland problem. This is now any city's problem, whether it's Astoria, Medford, Eugene. This has become an urban problem, and I was just struggling with how you were defining municipal.
Okay.
So now, if you want to talk about Portland, we can talk about Portland. If you want to broaden it to municipal, we can talk about municipal.
Well, I guess I'm just curious, what will you do at the state level to make a difference, say, here on the streets in Portland?
Well, it's not what will I do, what am I doing? Unlike Tina and Christine, I mean, Tina wants to build $400,000 a door apartments and give homeless people a place to live. Christine wants to declare another emergency. Portland has declared homeless emergencies over and over again. It's like declaring a hopeless emergency. All you need to do is look out the window and you know we've got an emergency. So I have never subscribed to having meetings or drawing up 5-year plans. I've actually been doing it. I was part of a group of people who helped repurpose the abandoned Wapato jail, built at huge public expense, and then just left because nobody passed an operating levy. And so I went to law school with the fellow that bought it. I called him up and I said, he was going to tear it down, before you scrape this building, would you consider giving some of the equipment that's still there to a not-for-profit that I knew that was functioning on the coast? Little did I know that the county had absolutely denuded that building. They'd taken everything out of it. But during the course of these kind of casual negotiations, the executive director of the not-for-profit and Jordan Schnitzer, who owned the building, met each other. And when Alan told Jordan his story, Jordan realized the really visionary view that Alan had about trying to end homelessness. And Alan comes to this discussion with a degree of authenticity that others don't. Alan spent 26 years on the streets as a meth addict and actually facilitated a botched crime so that he would get arrested. The arresting officer is now coincidentally on Alan's board, but Alan describes being arrested as being rescued. He got clean, came out of the penitentiary and said, I want to figure out a methodology to help others. What grew out of that is Helping Hands, which is a now shelter. The jail doesn't look like a jail at all. A lot of private money, some state money was spent to completely transform that place, Wapato, that's now called the Bybee Lakes Hope Center, into a place of healing, recovery, and hope. And so I've been involved right straight along. My husband's on the board. I've been on an advisory board. I have helped raise philanthropic money in the early days of Helping Hands. So I don't talk about it, I do it. And I believe that the model that is represented in Helping Hands is the proper model. Now, we've taken an enormous amount of criticism from the city and the county because ours is a trauma-informed, data-driven, individualized treatment. We talk to the person. What's your story? Why are you on the streets? Is it poverty? Is it domestic violence? Is it drugs? Is it mental illness? And then develop an individual treatment plan for each one of those people. And they work their plan. We have wraparound services, so there's medical available there. And that's the kind of approach. People are expected to work, they're expected to stay clean and sober, they're expected to contribute to their room and board. And because that's described as high barrier, we've been subject to a lot of criticism. I will submit that the chances of recovery from addiction or mental illness or homelessness writ large exists at Bybee Lakes and does not exist in facilities that are designed to enable continued using, continued alcoholism. You can't just put people in a building and hope they're going to get better. There has to be a plan. And what Bybee Lakes represents is the kind of treatment that I think results in success.
So do you plan on doing more of
Yes, I think Bybee Lakes could be replicated. Now, each successful operation like Bybee Lakes requires a charismatic leader. And finding those charismatic leaders, like Alan Evans, who will step forward and galvanize other people around them in believing that a successful outcome is achievable. It's not a cookie cutter. You'd have to grow in Klamath Falls or Burns, or you'd have to find that charismatic leader. And it might not always be done on the same scale as Bybee Lakes Hope Center. That's 150,000 square feet. But I think that the philosophy is replicable, and I would encourage doing that.
So will you allow camping on the sidewalks?
No.
And what will you do to stop that? I mean, there's so many tents out there.
Well, what I said in the beginning part of this interview, enforce the law, find alternative space. Let me give you an example. The Metro Center parking lot. You could establish that alternative space that makes moving people off of the streets legal and acceptable. I don't know if Metro will give up that space. You'd have to go ask Metro. But if there was an alternative space, then you've got the opportunity to move people off the streets. And then you've got to have the force of will, both in Portland and at the state level, to actually do that, move people off the streets.
Yeah. So you talk of ending homelessness, and in your plan, you know, one of the things you say you'll do is create more safe designated camping areas. What do you mean by that specifically?
The Metro parking lot.
Okay.
I mean, you asked me for an example, and I'm giving you an example. Unused warehouse space, other big parking facilities. If we're serious about doing this, it has to be all hands on deck. And I would submit, if Metro provides an option, either in the Expo Center itself or in the parking lot, let's explore it fully. And you'd have to ask Metro why they haven't offered that up. But I would certainly look at it as a viable alternative.
You said you will repeal Measure 110 or work to repeal it. What will that take?
The governor can't repeal it. That was voted in by the public. And so I would ask the legislature to re-refer it to the public. And if they don't do it, then I'd lead the petition drive to do it. I believe that voters in Oregon got pulled into a kind of disingenuous, not completely honest campaign. if the question, and this is how it was presented to voters, was treatment or criminalization, well, everybody wants to see addicts get treatment. But it in effect legalized hard drugs. And that drugs are at the root of every urban ill as I see it. They're exacerbating mental illness. Certainly the open market drug trafficking that's going on in town. I witness it every day that I come downtown, and it is getting increasingly menacing and increasingly violent. I mean, there were drug transactions going on in that fountain across the street from the U.S. Bank, where people are wielding big knives. So drugs are at the base of this, and let's not forget, I mean, aside from ballot measure 110, we also have the illegal drug trade in the southern part of this state, Jackson, Josephine counties, where it is my opinion, informed by conversations with county commissioners and sheriffs, that the cartel activities there are fueling a black market in drugs that escapes paying the taxes that were anticipated when marijuana was legalized in Oregon, and is driving a subculture of criminal behavior, including environmental crimes, including human trafficking, including abuse of pesticides that further deteriorates the environment. And so our drug problem is not singularly 110. But I would work like hell to get 110 re-referred to the voters, and let's have an honest debate about the pernicious effect of drugs and the open-air drug markets that are now proliferating our cities.
So say Measure 110 was repealed, do you have a plan to address how that would affect the police department and our jails that are already overrun and short-staffed?
Well, tell me how it's helping the police departments now. I mean, it took the state forever to get the program up and going. I have yet to have anybody convince me that the money that we've handed out so far is efficacious. Did the money go to programs that have a track record of success? How was the money distributed? What are going to be the accountability measures? I don't want to waste nearly $1 billion to find out that it didn't work. I think if it's repealed and you have an honest discussion about should we have the decriminalization of hard drugs embedded in that measure, that Oregonians might vote differently, particularly as crime and drug dealing and drug abuse has accelerated in especially Portland.
I want to talk about affordable housing. You say Oregon needs to build 580,000 new housing units over the next 2 decades to close the housing supply deficit. How do you plan to do that?
Well, one of the things is to reduce the regulatory burden. Affordable housing is not $400,000 a door. And with all of the regulations and the impediments and the paucity of developable land, we are driving the costs per unit through the ceiling. Now there's a big push to get rid of natural gas. And how much more is that going to accelerate the cost of housing? We've got to get realistic about the fact that we have an affordability crisis because we have a supply crisis. And so at some point we're going to have a conversation around the margins of the UGB to open up more property. When the House Bill 100, that was the Farm and Forest Land Protection Bill, was passed, that was 50 years ago. There were 3 million less Oregonians. And we've got to have a discussion about where those folks go. It can't just be urban density. At some point, we're gonna need to have more developable land, both for residential as well as industrial. I mean, that's the reason Intel left. They needed to expand and were constrained on available land in their Hillsborough facility, and they took a piece of their business to Ohio. We all ought to be embarrassed about that. That's our biggest employer and Intel's biggest R&D facility in the world. Nobody, when I asked, could this have been prevented, the answer was yes. Somebody in the governor's office could have picked up the phone and said, what does the customer need?
These affordable housing units oftentimes take a lot of time to develop and build. Do you have plans to address that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. First of all, time and money don't seem to matter to state agencies. We've got to have permitting that is predictable, timely. If you're going to say yes quickly. If you're going to say no quickly. I think we need to recognize that many of these big, complicated housing projects, like multifamily, multiple unit, are relying on a mosaic of money. And the financiers have to believe that there is a pathway to get permitted, or they're going to walk away from these deals. And the more often that Oregon is seen as being business unfriendly, development unfriendly, and a regulatory morass, that reputation is going to spread. And developers could make a choice, come out here and tangle with all of the requirements and the regulations, or go to some friendlier state where it's faster to do that. Now, I'm not saying run roughshod over the regulations. I'm saying it's time to have a review. Let's stop doing sequential permitting that gives one agency at the very end go, no-go authority over whether or not to build. Let's help developers understand the mosaic of permitting that we need to go through in Oregon. Have some pathfinders from Housing and Community Development work directly with developers. Get the legislature to stop telling developers and home builders how to build homes and develop. They know they don't need legislative interference that simply drives costs. And by that I'm talking about all the amenities and accoutrements that are frequently required in developments. The legislature describing the kind of parking, the legislature describing the kind of EV charging stations. Not that I think that's bad, but somewhere along the line we've got to recognize that as the legislature is making more proscriptions, that's driving cost, which ultimately gets pushed onto the consumer.
We have a lack of addiction treatment facilities. What will you do to address that and to expand those services? Well,
a variety of things, none the least of which is let's recognize that those addiction facilities need to be spread all over the state. When many people came out of institutional living situations, it was with the promise that they could seek treatment in their own communities. The legislature never came through with that. And so I think we have to recognize that there is a statewide interest in making sure that services are dispersed. We ought to, it all comes back to housing as well. There is no psychiatrist right now, unless that's changed in the very short-term past. There's been no psychiatrist in Clatsop County that I represented in the legislature for a long time. It's hard to recruit mental health professionals to a place where there is no affordable housing. And so understanding that in some cases the state may have to subsidize a minimum level of care someplace by recruiting psychiatrists or other absolutely essential allied healthcare workers, social workers, mental health therapists, psychologists, the allied healthcare professions in addition to a MD psychiatrist. So there is a state role in making sure that these services are available. Then there's a state role in making sure that the services are efficacious. This is not a situation of too little money. It's a situation frequently of a lack of leadership and a lack of accountability that makes sure that that money's being well spent. Let's go back to the housing situation for a second. Right now, with the federal money, there are a lot of strings. For example, harm reduction. So maybe you're passing out needles versus doing the kind of on-the-ground casework that actually results in somebody getting wraparound services and the ability to move from the streets to self-sufficiency. We make the assumption that if you just give people keys to an apartment that they're going to automatically be able to live in a situation that's much more structured than the streets. We've got to do some education. We've got to have caseworkers that know people's names. We've got to have much more intensive and wraparound services, not make somebody who's trying to escape the streets run from one door to the next to find either mental health or food support or veterans benefits that they have been promised and earned. That's one of the beauties of Bybee Lakes. I got a very prominent dental care company here in Oregon to donate an entire dental suite. And so you've got to take care of the whole person and not expect somebody who is maybe coming to terms with sobriety for the first time in decades to be their own best advocate. There's a state interest in making sure that there are properly equipped advocates who will almost one person at a time in some instances walk people through what they need to achieve the tools to maintain their own sobriety.
Okay. I have one final question then. Okay. All right, well, if homelessness is someone's #1 concern going into this election, why should they vote for you?
Well, because I've got a track record. Drive out to Helping Hands and see what's happening out there. If it appears that I take enormous pride in that, it's because I do. We're doing it. We're not talking about it. We're not waiting until housing units are built. We are taking people off the streets and putting them in a setting where they can achieve and maintain their own sobriety with the dignity of work and the investment in their own futures. It is a place of hope, healing, and recovery. And so for me, it's not hypothetical. I can drive out there and I can talk to guys that work there. I watch people that have come through the program now assume leadership roles in helping others achieve and maintain sobriety. And so I would say, if you want to know why I should be the next governor, drive out to Bybee Lakes Hope Center and take a look. That's the vision that I started delivering years ago. I met Alan Evans almost 20 years ago. I have in the private sector helped raise money for Helping Hands. I have encouraged philanthropy to give to Helping Hands. And so I would submit, I've got a 20-year track record. I'm not new to this. Tina has styled herself as the person who's the housing czar of Oregon. I would pose the question, why then is it getting worse instead of better? And I would submit that instead of thinking about it or planning meetings or describing plans, I'm doing it. Go to Bybee Lakes and see.
Thank you so much for your time.
You bet.
Appreciate it.
What's the